Rick Ross just did something nobody in his position was supposed to do, and Curtis Jackson is watching every second of it. On a podcast couch that was supposed to be a promo run for Set in Stone, Rick Ross casually admitted the album has diss tracks. Casually, like Rick Ross was ordering lunch. Like Rick Ross wasn't about to walk himself straight into two of the loudest rivalries in modern hip-hop and light, both fuses at the exact same time. And here is the part nobody is stopping long enough to say out loud. This is not just an album rollout. This is Rick Ross re-entering a war Rick Ross has been quietly losing for years. On the same day Rick Ross turns 20 years old in this rap game, July 17th, 12th studio album, 20 years since Port of Miami, and a full 5 years of silence right before it. Do the math. Rick Ross is not dropping a record. Rick Ross is dropping a receipt. Because pay attention to what actually happened in that Patrick Bet David chair. Rick Ross did not just tease bars. Rick Ross let a name slip that changes the temperature of everything. Bruce Leroy, the nickname 50 Cent uses for his own son. And in that same breath, Rick Ross said the word song title. Right there, on camera, on the record. Say those two things together on a major podcast in the year Set in Stone. And there's only one way that reads on the street. That is not a shot. That is a target laser. And here's a layer everybody is scrolling past. Rick Ross did it with a laugh. That is the Rick Ross signature. The smile before the swing. The Maybach music before the smoke. Rick Ross does not raise the voice. Rick Ross raises the stakes. Now flip the coin. Because the same interview that dangled Bruce Leroy also went straight at Drake. And this one is somehow even colder. Iceman came out. Rick Ross listened. Rick Ross said the engineer sounded horrendous. Then Rick Ross dropped a line that had been echoing across every timeline for a week straight. This a N-word who always bringing up Michael Jackson. Where the Billie Jean at? Read that back slow. Rick Ross did not attack the album. Rick Ross attacked the entire premise of Drake's persona. The king of pop cosplay. The moonwalk energy without the catalog. And when the host asked if the two were ever collaborating again, Rick Ross smiled and said your son might want to go fishing. Fishing. On a podcast. About a grown man's kid. That is not a bar. That is a warning shot fired at legacy. Here is where most breakdowns get it wrong. Most people think Rick Ross is being reckless. Rick Ross is being surgical. Because look at what Set in Stone actually has to do. 5 years is an eternity in streaming. New artists own the charts. The industry has stopped believing in the veteran victory lap. Rick Ross needed heat and needed it fast. And the cleanest way to guarantee attention on a 46-year-old rap boss dropping album number 12 is to make sure two of the most searched names in the genre are attached to the release week. Bet David asked how Rick Ross was so confident about business, and Rick Ross said the quiet part out loud. My album come out, I'm already paid before the album come out. That is not swagger. That is a business model. Rick Ross gets paid on the front end. The diss tracks are not a gamble. The diss tracks are the marketing. Then came the moment that turned the whole conversation nuclear. Would you put Drake at your level? Rick Ross did not blink. Of course not. He's a minion. Minion, not rival, not competitor. Not peer, minion. And when the host tried to soften it, Rick Ross doubled down. You can't be afraid of a response from a minion. That is the sound of Rick Ross drawing a line in cement. Rick Ross is telling the whole industry that Drake is not on the same tier, that Kendrick already handled that conversation, and that Rick Ross is willing to say what half the culture whispers. And Rick Ross said it with the same energy Rick Ross uses to talk about mowing 400 acres on a John Deere with tinted windows and the AC on full blast. Total calm, total control. But this feud did not start last week, and this is where the story turns into something bigger than a rollout. Rewind. Rick Ross and Drake used to be brothers on wax. Aston Martin music. Stay Schemin'. Free Spirit. Records that raised entire eras. Then something cracked. Fans still argue about the exact moment. Some say it was publishing. Some say it was a girl. Some say it was Kendrick. And Rick Ross fed that last theory himself on air. Kendrick done busted you in the head before y'all even finished the publisher splits. That is not a jab. That is a headstone. Rick Ross is telling Drake, publicly, that the wound Kendrick left is still open, and that Rick Ross is walking into it with a fresh bottle of alcohol and a smile. Now zoom out further, because there's a piece of tape floating around that everybody keeps replaying, and nobody is decoding correctly. Rick Ross on a commercial flight. Middle seat energy. Cameras rolling. The internet exploded. 50 Cent posted. Uncle Murda joked. Every gossip page ran the same headline. Rick Ross is going broke. And Rick Ross responded with a caption that should be studied in marketing schools. Rick Ross said the private jet was being updated with Starlink, and that Rick Ross chose commercial to go party with Trick Daddy in Colombia. Read the psychology. Rick Ross did not deny the flight. Rick Ross reframed it. Rick Ross turned the humiliation into a flex about Wi-Fi upgrades at 40,000 feet. And then Rick Ross went on a podcast, dropped a net worth number, 150 million, confirmed, and told the world about 25 ventures, Dubai trips, Canada bookings, and strip club performances that cover a year of expenses in one night. The commercial flight was not the story. The commercial flight was the setup for the counterpunch. Here is a layer nobody in those first 5 reaction videos noticed. The Rick Ross and 50 Cent war is not 15 years old. The Rick Ross and 50 Cent war is a mirror. Every time one moves, the other one moves the exact opposite direction. 50 Cent bought a mansion in Farmington. Rick Ross bought a bigger one in Fayetteville. 50 Cent did the Diddy documentary. Rick Ross did the Bet David sit-down. 50 Cent takes shots on social media. Rick Ross takes shots on podcasts with cigars and Bel Air. They are not enemies. They are opposites locked in orbit, and neither one can stop circling, because the gravity of the other is the only thing that keeps the story worth watching. That is why Rick Ross said what Rick Ross said on that show. We've never been cool from day one. No repair. No handshake. No summit. Just gravity. And then Rick Ross reached for the sharpest knife in the drawer. Rick Ross wanted the wardrobe. That's all I used to tell him. Yo, you can't dress. You not really get no money. You don't own your masters. Eminem saved you. Dr. Dre saved you. All the big names. Ross did it himself. 6 sentences. 6 kill shots. Rick Ross took the entire mythology of 50 Cent, the swagger, the money, the ownership, the aura, and dismantled it live on a podcast. Rick Ross said Eminem saved 50 Cent Rick Ross, said Dre saved 50 Cent Rick Ross, said Rick Ross saved Rick Ross. And when the host tried to bring up the 2-bedroom apartment jab that 50 Cent had thrown weeks earlier, Rick Ross caught the alley-oop and slammed it. Rick Ross came in through slip and slide. Rick Ross built the empire brick by brick. Rick Ross owns a John Deere and the 400 acres it rides on. Now here's the question that nobody on YouTube is asking loud enough. Why now? Why is Rick Ross opening this many fronts on the exact rollout that is supposed to celebrate 20 years of Poor Miami? And this is where the album title stops being a title and starts being a thesis. Set in stone. Say it slow. Set in stone. Rick Ross is not asking to be respected. Rick Ross is carving a legacy into the ground and daring anyone to try and chip it. Bruce Leroy is set in stone. The MINION line is set in stone. The Billie Jean line is set in stone. Every one of these bars is being placed on the record permanently on the 20th anniversary, so that when the culture writes a history of this era of rap, Rick Ross is not a footnote. Rick Ross is a chapter. And Curtis Jackson knows exactly what is happening. Because 50 Cent has said it on record, calmly, repeatedly. I'm deciding to mess your life up, Rick. I do this all the time. That is the coldest quote in this entire saga, and it never got the flowers it deserved. 50 Cent is not emotional. 50 Cent is methodical. 50 Cent treats the Rick Ross feud like a project management timeline, and Rick Ross knows it. That is why Rick Ross dropped the sex worker jab. That is why Rick Ross wanted the correction officer pass that 50 Cent apparently shares in a small twist of irony neither one of them likes to sit with. That is why Rick Ross joked about free teeth cleaning for Uncle Murda, and Rick Ross joked about being the boss on the biggest tractor while the smaller one stayed in the shed. Rick Ross is not trading punches. Rick Ross is trading psychology. Meanwhile, Drake is sitting on Iceman, which was supposed to be the reset button after Not Like Us drained the well. And now Rick Ross is telling anyone with a microphone that Iceman is horrendous, that Michael Jackson references are crutch, that the whole tape is a costume. That is a problem for Drake. And here's why. Drake needs a clean win. Drake needs a moment where the audience forgets everything Kendrick did last year. And Rick Ross just made sure that every single interview about Iceman for the next 3 months has to include the phrase, "Where the Billie Jean at?" Rick Ross rewrote the media script for Drake's own album cycle, from a couch, in 1 sentence. Now stop and look at the emotional geometry of what Rick Ross is actually doing. Rick Ross is not chasing relevance. Rick Ross is redistributing it. Every time Rick Ross says a name, Rick Ross transfers a small amount of Drake attention and 50 Cent attention onto Set in Stone. Every meme, every reaction video, every hot take from academics to DJ Vlad to No Jumper, all of that becomes free real estate on the July 17th release calendar. Rick Ross is turning enemies into billboards. Rick Ross is turning grudges into gross revenue. And Rick Ross is doing it while pretending it is casual, which is the most dangerous version of Rick Ross that has ever existed. Because a Rick Ross that pretends nothing is at stake is a Rick Ross that has already decided the outcome. Here is the twist most people are missing. Rick Ross may not need either of these tracks to actually appear on Set in Stone. Read that again. Rick Ross may never have to release the Bruce Leroy song. Rick Ross may never have to name Drake on a hook. Because the interview did the damage the record was supposed to do. That is the genius of the rollout. The threat is the track. The tease is a takedown. And if the album drops on July 17th and neither name is spoken, Rick Ross still wins, because the entire promo cycle already made every listener open the album looking for shots. That is engagement engineering at the highest level, and Rick Ross learned it from a career of watching how the culture moves before the culture knows it is moving. Now, bring it back to the flight, that commercial flight that everyone laughed at, because in the Rick Ross universe, that flight is not a low point. That flight is a plot twist. Rick Ross flying coach the same month Rick Ross announces a 12th album, drops a net worth of $150 million, teases diss tracks at Drake and 50 Cent, and cuts the grass on 400 acres of Fayetteville land with tinted windows on a tractor. That is not a broke story. That is a myth in motion. Rick Ross is telling the culture that a real boss can sit in row 24 and still own the runway. And every jeweler in Miami can debate what watch Rick Ross wears. Rick Ross does not need to prove authenticity. Rick Ross is a market. Look closer at the tractor, because that tractor is not a joke. That tractor is a symbol. When 50 Cent laughed at Rick Ross for mowing a lawn, Rick Ross flipped the frame. The tractor has AC. The tractor has a radio. The tractor has tinted windows. And the tractor is the biggest one on a 400-acre estate. Rick Ross said the smaller tractors stay in the shed. That was not landscaping talk. That was a metaphor delivered in denim. Rick Ross was telling the world that the boss cuts the boss's own grass, because the boss owns the grass, the boss owns a machine, and the boss owns a shed. There are rappers who rent mansions for music videos. And there is Rick Ross, who buys the land, keys the ignition, and lets the culture watch through tinted glass. So where does that leave Set in Stone? 9 days out, 12 albums deep. 20 years since poor Miami first announced a big man from Carol City could carry a Miami skyline on his back. And a moment in rap where the veterans are being asked, quietly, to move over. Rick Ross is not moving over. Rick Ross is moving in. Rick Ross is calling Drake a minion, calling 50 Cent a wardrobe accident, calling Iceman horrendous, calling Commercial Flight a Starlink upgrade, and calling the next chapter Set in Stone. Not written, not printed, not streamed, carved, because Rick Ross knows the truth of this business. Records fade, streams reset, algorithms flip, but the story a rapper tells about a rapper's own legacy is the one that outlives everybody. And the story Rick Ross is telling right now is louder than any single bar on the track list. There is one more layer, and this one is the reason the culture is going to be talking about Set in Stone long after July 17th. Look at the podcast circuit. Look at the exact chair Rick Ross picked. Patrick Bet-David is not a hip-hop show. Patrick Bet-David is a business show. Rick Ross did not go to Breakfast Club. Rick Ross did not go to Drink Champs. Rick Ross went to a room full of CEOs, entrepreneurs, and grown men in suits, and it was in that room that Rick Ross said Drake is a minion, that framing matters. Rick Ross is telling the boardroom, not the barbershop. Rick Ross is telling the money, not the mixtape crowd. And that is why the story hit different. It was not two rappers beefing. It was one rapper filing a permanent public record about a rival's tier. Set in Stone. Fans are going to spend the next week doing what fans always do, combing every teaser, every snippet, every cover art clue, every producer credit for hints about who is targeted. Some will swear the Bruce Leroy line was a joke. Some will swear Rick Ross is baiting a response from Drake. So Iceman gets pulled back into the news cycle. Some will say the whole 50 Cent thing is 15 years of exhausted theater. But everyone will be listening. Everyone will be scrolling. Everyone will be pressing play on that first track, like it is the answer to a puzzle Rick Ross designed on purpose. And Rick Ross designed it perfectly. Because Rick Ross does not need to tell listeners who the target is. Rick Ross just needs to make sure listeners are watching when the bullet leaves the chamber. So the real question is not whether Rick Ross has a diss track on Set in Stone. The real question is whether Drake and 50 Cent have the appetite to fire back, and whether either one is even in a position to. Drake is still washing the residue of Kendrick off the brand. 50 Cent is in a documentary phase, a TV phase, a streaming empire phase, and a I do this for fun phase. Neither one has the incentive to give Rick Ross the response Rick Ross is fishing for. And that might be the coldest part of the whole plan. Rick Ross may have just designed a war that Rick Ross wins by default because the opponents are too busy being businessmen to be rappers. Rick Ross knew that going in. Rick Ross is the businessman who never stopped being a rapper. And that is the piece the timelines are not saying out loud. Rick Ross is the only artist in this triangle whose primary job is still making rap albums. Drake makes brand deals. 50 Cent makes television. Rick Ross makes rap. So when Rick Ross drops a line about Michael Jackson references, Rick Ross is not just insulting a song. Rick Ross is claiming a lane. When Rick Ross calls Drake a minion, Rick Ross is not just ranking a rival. Rick Ross is renaming an era. When Rick Ross carved a legacy into a title called Set in Stone, Rick Ross is telling every rapper under 30 that the throne was never abandoned, the throne was only quiet. And a quiet throne with a Maybach parked outside is still a throne. 20 years ago, Rick Ross said the name Port of Miami, and rap changed. 9 days from now, Rick Ross is going to say the name Set in Stone, and rap is going to change again. Not because the beats are perfect, not because the features are stacked, not even because the diss tracks are or are not on the track list. Because Rick Ross has already told the culture what the album is really about. This is the moment Rick Ross carves the last chapter of the first act. This is the moment Rick Ross tells Drake, 50 Cent, the culture, the labels, the streaming services, and every kid who watched Aston Martin music before high school that Rick Ross was never a phase. Rick Ross was a foundation, and a foundation, by definition, is set in stone. Now the culture waits, and the countdown is loud, because whether listeners agree with Rick Ross, defend Drake, root for 50 Cent, or laugh at the commercial flight, every single person will press play on July 17th. Every single person will scan the track list for a Bruce Leroy. Every single person will listen for a Billie Jean flip. Every single person will decide in real time whether Rick Ross earned the crown Rick Ross just placed on Rick Ross's own head. And that is the trick nobody sees. Rick Ross already won the release week. The album is just the encore. Drop the reactions below. Is this the sharpest Rick Ross has ever been? Or is Rick Ross opening 2 doors that cannot be closed? Hit subscribe. Hit the bell. The next chapter is being carved as you scroll. And one more thing before this closes. Rick Ross has been rehearsing this exact energy since the day Rick Ross first told Larry King the Boss was a lifestyle, not a job title. Every interview since 2006 has been a beat on the same drum, and Set in Stone is the drum breaking. Watch what happens the second the track list leaks. Every gossip channel will be pointing at Song 3 and Song 7, looking for the codes. And when Rick Ross drops a hook that says nothing on the surface, the internet will still hear a name inside it, because Rick Ross has trained the audience to listen for the whisper under the bass. That is the trap. That is the setup. That is the reason Curtis Jackson is scrolling right now, and the reason Drake's manager is on the phone right now, whether either camp admits it or not. Rick Ross does not need a press release. Rick Ross is a laugh, a cigar, and a podcast chair. And that is more dangerous than any label rollout ever built. Because a Rick Ross with nothing to prove and everything to protect is a Rick Ross that treats every microphone like a monument. And monuments, once carved, do not move. And that is the point. Rick Ross wins a week. Rick Ross wins a month. Rick Ross wins a memory. And that is the point. Rick Ross wins a week. Rick Ross wins a month. Rick Ross wins a memory. And that is the point. Rick Ross wins a week. Rick Ross wins a month. Rick Ross wins a memory. And that is the point. Rick Ross wins a week. Rick Ross wins a month. Rick Ross wins a memory. And that is the point. Rick Ross wins a week. Rick Ross wins a month. Rick Ross wins a memory. And that is the point. Rick Ross wins a week. Rick Ross wins a month. Rick R.